and he took a loop of guinea pig intestine and he stretched it up in a vertical organ bath and attached to it a J-shaped tube. And he blew in the tube, and the gut blew back at him.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Longevity Roadmap. And today's podcast is going to be about a topic that I have a really hard time with, which is the gut. And I think this is a really important one to listen to. It is with the father of neurogastroenterology, Dr. Michael Gershon at Columbia. And it's important to listen to not only because it's Dr. Gershon, and, he's sort of the guy who knows the most about this probably in the world, the enteric nervous system and, its relationship to the brain and all that kind of thing. But it's also important because this area is probably less well understood than most things that we talk about in health and longevity. It is also the space where there is probably more false information or, sort of poorly studied information being disseminated in a way that people take it as fact. And so I think it's a really important one to pay attention to. And, again, you will learn a ton here about neurogastroenterology. So I hope you enjoy it, the interview with Dr. Michael Gershon.
Hey, longevity enthusiasts, it's time to take it to the next level. I've been fine-tuning my longevity regimen for years, and I look better and feel better than I did a decade ago. In fact, my blood work is even better than it was back then. And it's all because of my data-driven regimen, and it's inspired me to create a course and community just for you. It's called the Longevity Roadmap, and I urge you to check it out. If you're tired of your belly fat, tired of being tired, or just want to optimize yourself for the next 50 years, visit longevityroadmap.com. That's longevityroadmap.com.
Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Michael Gershon. He's a renowned professor of pathology and cell biology at Columbia University. Dr. Gershon is widely regarded as the father of neurogastroenterology for his groundbreaking work on the enteric nervous system and its role in controlling gastrointestinal behavior. He's also the author of The Second Brain, which has made the enteric nervous system more accessible to a broad audience. He has a career spanning over 6 decades, nearly 400 peer-reviewed papers, and continues to reshape our knowledge of gut health. Welcome, Dr. Gershon.
Thank you.
So great to have you on. This is a topic that I have to tell you that as a physician, I am still very confused about. And I find it very perplexing. But I want to start out with just sort of getting the audience kind of up to date with some basics. When we talk about the enteric nervous system, can you kind of help people understand what exactly is the enteric nervous system and what is its role in controlling the gastrointestinal tract?
So the enteric nervous system is the nervous system that is intrinsic to the bowel. It's been known to be in existence for a long time, having first been discovered while we were fighting our Civil War by Auerbach in Germany in 1866. And he noticed at that time that there were a whole hell of a lot of nerve cells in the bowel. Since then, in a drafty laboratory in London, I know it was drafty because I did my postdoc in Oxford and worked through the winter there. Bayliss and Starling, 2 British physiologists, were playing with the intestine of a dog. And what they did was cut all the nerves running to the intestine, and then they pinched it. And when they pinched the intestine, it would respond all the time with the stereotype behavior of oral contraction, anal relaxation that was propulsive. And since they cut all the nerves to it, and they found they could eliminate that with a local anesthetic, they attributed it to what they called the local nervous mechanism of the gut. So Bayliss and Starling were very much into what they called laws, and that oral contraction, anal relaxation that propelled things down was called by them the law of the intestine. They had a law of the circulation, a law of the heart. This was the law of the intestine. And because they knew about Auerbach's work, they could talk about the local nervous mechanism being all these nerve cells that Auerbach had found in the gut. Fast forward 18 years, great armies were engaged in World War I in Europe. Trenches divided the continent from the English border to the English Channel to the Swiss border. And behind the lines in Germany, a German scientist by the name of Trendelenburg got tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis kept you out of the trenches, even in the German army. But he had to keep busy. So to keep off the street, so to speak, and earn his living, he did experiments, and he took a loop of guinea pig intestine, and he stretched it up in a vertical organ bath and attached to it a J-shaped tube. And he blew in the tube, and the gut blew back at him. And this was a pretty amazing thing to see. Because there was nothing in the tube except gut. The brain, spinal cord, all the peripheral ganglia were in the garbage with the rest of the animal. Nothing was there but gut. And what they had seen was the oral contraction, anal relaxation propelling, the same phenomenon that had been seen by Baylis and Starling, the law of the intestine. Trendelenburg, perhaps because he was German, was less poetic than Baylis and Starling, so he called that the peristaltic reflex, which is what we call it today. It's a peristaltic reflex. It moves things along. Later, the autonomic nervous system was defined largely by Langley, who is well known in the field as a son of a bitch, because he had an interesting idea. He owned then the Journal of Physiology, which was extremely renowned, highly prestigious, and it still is. And he left that to the British Physiological Society. The British don't call it the British Physiological Society. They have a kind of all-encompassing view of the world. It's just the Physiological Society. Mm-hmm. But it's Britain.
Yeah.
And that's where they are. Anyway, he defined the autonomic nervous system as having not two, which is what I was taught in medical school, and you might have been.
Right. Yep.
Parts, sympathetic and the parasympathetic, but three. Why three? Well, there's two parts. The sympathetic had an outflow from the central nervous system, which was thoracic and lumbar, and a parasympathetic, which connected to the CNS at the cranial and sacral levels of the spinal cord. The enteric nervous system, however, he knew to have millions of neurons in it. And he also knew there are only a few thousand in human efferent vagal fibers, that is, vagal fibers carrying information from the gut to the brain going through the diaphragm. And so he thought, and it turned out he was right, that most of the nerve cells in the gut have no direct connection to the CNS. So he therefore figured this couldn't be either sympathetic or parasympathetic. Mm-hmm. Therefore, he called it enteric. So it's different from the other two because the gut is the only organ which can, by itself, without any assistance from the brain or spinal cord, mediate reflex and integrative neural activity all on its own. So when I went to medical school, I was taught that all these ganglia in the gut, these nerves, were relay ganglia in the vagal pathway driving the stomach. But at the same time, my teachers, surgeons, were going out, cutting the vagus in humans because they thought that peptic ulcer disease was psychogenic. And they thought if they cut the vagus, it would get better. It didn't, but they cut the vagus anyway. But the gut pursued on, just kept going. The doctrine that all those nerve cells were reliant on their connection to the brain would have said the gut should have been paralyzed. It wasn't, and it isn't. So we now know, and it's now very widely accepted, and the reason I gave my book the title, The Second Brain, is because it acknowledges that the enteric nervous system, the intrinsic nervous system of the gut, is unique in the body and able to manifest integrative neural activity all on its own.
When you talk about the specific enteric nervous system beyond peristalsis, what are some of the functions that we think that would be, uniquely just the enteric nervous system?
So the gut does a lot of things that are very complicated. For one thing, you depend on your gut for nutrition. So we eat, food is digested, that is, the complex molecules that we eat are broken down into small molecules, which we can absorb. So the gut controls a lot of complex organic chemical reactions. And as we know from organic chemistry, organic chemical reactions don't go right unless you stir them. So the gut has to show motion, keep the thing stirred up. You have to get the acidity, that is the pH, right. The salt conditions have to be right. So all those local conditions have to be known and regulated, and that's done locally. The brain doesn't have to bother with that kind of stuff.
Kind of what I was getting at with that question is there's this presumably an integration between, the sympathetic, parasympathetic systems with this enteric system. I'm trying to understand sort of how they all kind of work together.
So we've had to readjust the relationship that we talk about. All of the discussion we've had now is sort of a top-down kind of thing, in which we think about the final end, that is gut moving, ions flowing, pH getting regulated. But of course, to do all of that, there's got to be back talk the other way. So the largest part of the vagus nerve, most of the fibers, carry information from the gut to the brain. And that is supplemented by spinal nerves that indirectly also carry mostly pain fiber information to the brain. So much of what goes up from gut to brain, we call homeostatic. In part, that means I really don't know what it is. It's a nice term for, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But it also means it keeps things on an even keel, regulated properly. So there's a great deal of brain-gut and gut-brain, both-way communications. And when the brain needs to send information to the gut, it does so via the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So the sympathetic nervous system talks to the enteric nervous system, and the enteric nervous system can talk back. There are nerve fibers that run from the gut to, for example, sympathetic ganglia. So when the gut doesn't want to get a message, so to speak, for whatever reason, from the brain by way of the sympathetic prevertebral ganglia, which are the three major ganglia that talk to the gut, it can talk back and cancel it.
The spinal cord injury, I mean, I guess I'm just like thinking anatomy here. For most people, those systems are not going to be interrupted, right? I mean, if you're basically going up to the vagus nerve, so why do you see change? I mean, I don't have that much experience in treating spinal cord patients, but my understanding was they did have some issues with, GI motility and that kind of thing. Is that just from not moving, or is that just unrelated to this?
Well, remember the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and as well as voluntary nervous system, all work together with the bowel. So, for example, defecation involves opening sphincters. That involves both sympathetic control and GI control. And although peristalsis and motion, digestion, all those good things can occur in the absence of sympathetic or parasympathetic input, that doesn't mean they're optimal.
Right.
So, for example, the sympathetic nervous system and the vagus is very important in control of sphincters. For example, to get the stomach to empty right, that depends a lot on the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Get the esophagus to open, that requires vagal input. To get the stomach to relax, I mean, many of us eat a lot. So if we go in to get pizza, we get one too many.
Yeah.
So the stomach has to expand to let that happen. And that expansion, without increasing the pressure in the stomach, which is known as capacitance, requires vagal input. So there is a great deal of crosstalk. And one of the things that I now am studying a great deal is brain-gut communication. You mentioned IBS in your introduction, which is irritable bowel syndrome, but much of that is now considered a disorder of gut-brain communication. It's another way of thinking.
Yeah. Tell us about that. What is the latest, thought on what's going on there?
So the thought is that what we've just been talking about, that there's a great deal of crosstalk between brain and gut, and that has to be going properly. And so you can interfere with that at lots of different levels. You can interfere with that at the level of the brain, or you could interfere with that at the level of the gut. For example, one way you can disturb that is to send the wrong kind of information to the brain. So the brain would send inappropriate signals to the bowel. And although the gut can work in the absence of input from the brain, it doesn't mean it's going to. For example, whenever I call NIH, National Institutes of Health, for your listeners, to hear how my latest grant application has done, I become painfully aware of the kind of effect the brain can have on the gut.
Right. Exactly. I understand.
So that would be an inappropriate kind of information going.
Yeah.
There are other times when the gut could be closed down. For example, if you're in a position at wartime and you're in your foxhole and your defensive position has broken down and the enemy is coming and it's time to leave the foxhole and head to the rear, that would be an inappropriate time to get a message to defecate.
Yeah. So I guess the question, these things that you're talking about so far are things that everyday, well, not the foxhole thing, but certainly calling the NIH, that kind of thing, people can relate with that as a fairly normal kind of thing. But, with irritable bowel, it's not happening when it should. And so is there, obviously some of these communications that you're talking about are not working the way they are supposed to. Is there some kind of underlying pathophysiology that is causing that we're aware of?
The answer is yes and no. If I could come to you with a simple answer to what is the cause of IBS that could explain it in 100% of people, I would have an all expenses paid vacation in Stockholm in December.
Yeah, sure.
That's not happening. At least not to me, not now.
Yeah.
However, we do know that it varies and that many things can input disorders of gut-brain communication. As I said, it may be an intrinsic deficit in the gut having to do with infections in early life. It could follow a major infection. Post-infectious IBS is very common. It could be due to anxiety, which is due to psychoneurosis, or it could be due to disordered input coming from the microbiome of the bowel, which is another player in the system that is a major factor. So for the people who, among your listeners who might not know, we are in many ways platforms that carry bacteria around. we have at least as many bacteria in us as we have cells. Then we have more bacterial genes than we have genes of our own. And these bacteria live in huge numbers within the gut. And they send signals to the bowel, and that information can be transmitted to the brain and utilized within the gut itself. To manipulate those bacteria, we try to take probiotics, which are helpful bacteria.
And let me ask you this, though, in terms of what obviously a lot of this is, you're saying we don't know the precise mechanism, but what is the potential idea behind what's wrong with it? Is it potentially related to neurotransmitter production, altered functions like that? Is there some idea on what the microbiome could be doing that's affecting that function?
Well, the microbiome consists of many, as I said, billions, possibly trillions of bacteria. They interact with the wall of the gut because they have particular molecules on their surface that just by touching the receptive surface of some cells of the gut can activate signals so they are perceived. Some of them also make metabolites that are absorbed and can influence the bowel. So some can change neurotransmitter production, but they can also send nerve signals. Show you how this works. In the wall of the bowel, there's a small number of specialized cells known as enteroendocrine cells. Entero because the Greek word for gut is the enteron. So you see the term enteric, and these are enteroendocrine, and they're endocrine because they secrete into the blood, not into the lumen of the bowel. And one subset of them is known as the EC, or enterochromaffin cell, and it makes the signaling molecule serotonin. So 95% of the serotonin in the body is produced in the gut. The bulk of that is made by these EC cells. Well, what is it doing? It does lots of things. So the EC cells send serotonin out. It activates the gut's intrinsic primary afferent or sensory nerve cell, triggers a reflex, and that gets the peristaltic reflex going. So serotonin can start the peristaltic reflex. It also starts secretory reflexes. It can transmit information to sensory nerves that carry to the bowel, to the brain rather. It can be influenced in sending out pain. Some of the bacteria can activate the secretion of serotonin in the gut. And that can cause everything from pain, messages to the brain, changing homeostasis, or trigger inflammation. So serotonin is a multi-purpose signaling molecule that these cells use. But these are only one of the types of cells. There are many others. There are cells that use other chemicals, such as cholecystokinin, that cause pancreas to secrete, cause the gallbladder to contract, and cause you to stop eating by sending messages to the brain by way of the vagus nerve. So these bacteria can cause certain cells of the gut to secrete molecules that activate nerves that signal to within the bowel and signal to the nervous system.
I'm just curious when you talk about serotonin and some of the other dopamine and things like that. I start thinking about, is there potentially, do we see any relationship with irritable bowel and various mood disorders, or with drugs such as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are often seen in depression? I'm just curious on what we know about that.
Well, we know a lot about it, and these molecules are all related. So serotonin as a signaling molecule works by turning on a switch. And those switches are called receptors. And for serotonin, they come in 7 classes of receptor, named uninterestingly 1 through 7. Serotonin turns those switches on. But once the switch goes on, you can't leave the serotonin on the switch. We've got to get the serotonin off the switch so that the switch can go from on back to off again. So to do that, the mechanism is to remove the serotonin. The nerves that put it out, when it's a neurotransmitter, have a molecule called SERT, the serotonin reuptake transporter. And so the nerve pumps it out, and the transporter takes it back. The SSRIs and other antidepressants inhibit SERT. Now, if they inhibit SERT, they make the action of serotonin last longer, and they make it more effective, stronger, because it's not removed quickly enough. And so it keeps going. And if it pushes it to extreme, the receptor just can't stand it anymore and desensitizes, turns off. So SSRIs work, initially at least, by stimulating inhibiting SERT. We have since discovered that if we inhibit SERT only in the epithelium, that is the lining of the bowel, you can have amazing effects. For example, if you take mice and you knock the molecule out just in the epithelium of the gut, leave it intact in the brain, leave it intact everywhere else, the mice show less anxiety and less depression. So taking it out in the epithelium is anxiolytic and antidepressive, which means that serotonin signaling at that level, just in the epithelium, where the epithelium of the gut lining controls it, has effects on mood. And that's because it modulates the signals that serotonin can send up to the brain. And so if you take out the vagus nerve just by selectively knocking out the vagus sensory nerve cells that carry information from the gut to the brain, you block those effects of SERT on the gut, SERT inhibition on the gut. And in the SSRIs, or knocking out SERT genetically, all have the same effect. So one type of research that's going on now is to try to find a gut-restricted form of an SSRI. That is an SSRI that is not totally absorbed, can't go to the brain. Why would you want to do that? Because some of the effects of the SSRIs in the brain are not good. They're untoward. They impede sex drive. They can be anhedonic. That is, interfere with fun.
So what's interesting to me, though, is so do we know, so people have depression and irritable bowel syndrome when they are on SSRIs. Do we know if there seems to be a positive effect on the irritable bowel syndrome?
For some, yes. For some, quite the opposite. But either way, you get effects. What is true also is that depression during pregnancy and early postpartum period are often on SSRIs. And if they take an SSRI during pregnancy, that means the fetus is also taking an SSRI.
Yeah.
Instead of becoming antidepressive for fetuses, what that tends to do in later life is leave a deficient enteric nervous system. And so these people grow up with a high tendency to have chronic constipation. So there are long-term effects of taking SSRIs. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, depression can be a lethal condition that leads to suicide. And an SSRI high can be life-saving. But there are possibility of long-term effects on the fetus.
What are some of the other mechanisms, I guess, just in terms of potential drug interventions for motility disorders other than, those related to serotonin?
Well, there are many. There are some that work through the motilin receptor, and it can activate the gut. That would be useful for constipation. You can change the absorption of ions in the gut to increase the fluidity and the lumen of the gut. People eat more fiber. That can increase the bulk inside the gut and provide more stimulus to peristaltic reflexes.
Well, it seems like the reason I was specifically asking with regard to irritable bowel was that it's not necessarily just constipation. It's not necessarily just diarrhea. It's a constellation of symptoms that, decreasing motility alone may not be what you want to do. So it was kind of
very frequent comorbidity, as you've already mentioned, with depression and anxiety.
Right.
I'm not sure how much of that is because it's the same disease operating in the gut and the brain, or whether it's gut is working right. It's depressing.
You've also looked, I understand, at the role of varicella zoster and how it may have an effect on enteric neurons. Do you want to talk a little bit about that for our listeners?
So that's my family research. I call it my family research because I collaborate with my wife, the virologist.
Okay, got it.
So varicella zoster, other name is chickenpox virus. And that virus used to be present in about 99.9% of us during childhood. And then once it infected you, classically, it was known to take up residence in sensory ganglia, dorsal roots, spinal ganglia, and cranial nerves. And for reasons that were unknown, but possibly related to stress later in life, the virus would reactivate in those cells, come down the nerves, and make a very painful rash called shingles. That disease is now largely preventable in childhood because one of my wife's great achievements was to develop the chickenpox vaccine.
Oh, wow. That was her. Spared a lot of kids that 2 weeks home from school, I guess.
Yes, and lots of other, and it was known as a benign virus, relatively, but that being a relative term, every now and again, 100 American kids a year would die because the virus was not so benign in those kids.
Oh, wow.
And if they were getting immunosuppressive therapy, for example, cancer, the virus could kill them. So sparing all those kids chickenpox was good.
Yeah.
But in addition, later, the Shingrix, which is the current one, Varavax, came before it, was to boost immunity, to prevent shingles in adults, to keep up immunity. We'll get back to that in a minute. But what Ann and I, my wife and I, discovered, much to our surprise, when we were trying to grow this neuron in nerve cells, we found it grew very well in nerve cells from the gut. And so we looked at the human gut and found that 100% of people who had either had chickenpox as a child or been vaccinated against it has the virus latent, not only in nerve cells of the spinal cord, nerve cells of cranial nerves, but also in the bowel. And so enteric zoster, or reactivation within the gut, occurs. And most recently, we've discovered that a proportion of patients who have achalasia, which is a disturbing inability to swallow have varicella in the gut. And that is essentially a form of enteric shingles or enteric zoster, in which it's reactivated. But instead of just being a short-lived, self-limited period of time, the virus keeps slowly multiplying until it ultimately can destroy the entire enteric nervous system of the esophagus, leaving you with no esophageal peristalsis, and the sphincter, which is between the esophagus and the stomach, can't open.
Is that all cases of achalasia? Or most cases, I should say?
Well, in our first study, we looked at 15 cases that came to surgery and found varicella zoster proliferating in 13 of them.
Okay.
Since then, in doing a big clinical trial, we found that there may be some other cases in which have other conditions. So I can't say that it's 100%, but it's a very high percentage.
Well, the incidence of that should be going down then. With your, given the vaccination, I would think then we would see a decrease in incident of, achalasia. Obviously, it's not a very common disease in the first place, but are we seeing that? Are we seeing less and less cases?
We haven't been giving the Shingrix vaccine long enough, so we don't know. Unfortunately, the childhood vaccination is a live viral vaccine, and it establishes latency. And so you can get zoster from the virus you had as a child from the vaccination. However, having said that, I would point out that one encouraging thing is that the vaccine virus is much less likely to reactivate than the wild type virus. And so it's a rare cause of problem. We don't know whether Shingrix, that is the new zoster vaccine, will prevent achalasia, but we are testing the hypothesis that if we could eradicate the active infection with valacyclovir, an antiviral drug, it would improve the condition for the esophagus. So we are doing an active NIH-supported study right now with collaborators at Vanderbilt to test that idea. And it's too soon to say what the results are.
Yeah. I have one more question I should have asked you earlier, just in relation to some of the mood disorders and that kind of thing. But are there emerging therapies? I think I've heard of some of them regarding gut-brain axis targeting for conditions like PTSD and various neurodegenerative diseases as well.
Well, I'm sure there are, but I'm not expert on that.
Yeah.
Subject.
I was curious. It just came to mind. I was just thinking about other things that were related to that.
I don't want to talk about PTSD.
Sure. You got it.
I leave this interview with it.
There you go. So looking forward, I guess, based on your research, what people are looking at, what do you see as some of the most promising areas of research right now in your lab and, around in other neurogastroenterology labs?
Two areas of concentration in my lab include gut-brain communication, and I mentioned some of the recent findings to you. That was just published in a recent publication in gastroenterology. I told you about anxiety and the epithelium of the gut. And also the study that I'm doing now for achalasia, and studies that we have done and concluded, not yet published, showing the frequency of enteric zoster. Other people are working to find out, using molecular techniques, which are fantastic, what the nature of each cell in the enteric nervous system is and how they're put together. In the brain, it's a little bit easier, strangely, to study function of different nerve cells because they're functionally grouped. So they're different nuclei or aggregates of cells in the brain that are functionally arranged. So there's a motor cortex, a sensory cortex. But in the gut, the nerve cells are all intertwined, put together. And so it's more difficult to interrogate them.
Yeah.
So to do that, investigators now get them out and look individually at the genomes, not just the genes that they contain, but the transcripts they express. So they can look and see what each individual nerve cell is doing and classify them that way. So looking at the future, we will understand, I think, how the reflexes that Bayliss and Starling began to work on actually work, how different nerve cells put together, and how they control the behavior of the bowel and integrate all of these important detail to keep the gut going, and how gut-brain communication works, how the nervous system interacts with the immune system to protect the body. That's very important. We didn't say much about it. And one of the things I've called serotonin, by the way, is I've called it the sword and shield of the gut. Sword because sometimes it can trigger an inflammatory protective reaction when it detects the wrong kind of organisms getting in. Or in the nervous system, it has an anti-inflammatory neuroprotective role. So if there is a massive inflammation, it can protect what I call the crown jewels of the gut, the enteric nervous system. So taking a term from Jewish theology, which is usually applied to Father Abraham, I've called serotonin the sword shield of the gut.
Very good. Fantastic. Well, again, for those people who want to learn more, the book you have out is called The Second Brain. And, I encourage people to read it. I'm probably going to pick up a copy myself because, again, this is stuff I didn't learn a ton about in medical school. And it's, it is a very fascinating topic that, it seems to me that we're still so early in a lot of this understanding of this enteric nervous system. But I do want to thank you so much for being on the show and trying to help us understand it a little bit.
And just a word, in writing the book, I tried to make it understandable to the general public, and I used humor.
Oh, good.
One of the critics likened the prose to that of Woody Allen, just that it was okay anyway.
There you go. I mean, and you're in New York and you got some glasses. There you go. Perfect.
That's right.
Thanks again.
Thanks for listening. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe.